The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello and welcome everybody. My name is Nick Cortina. I'm excited to bring you a very interesting support lab today. Before we get started, I do just want to make sure that everyone can hear me, everyone can see my screen all right. So please go ahead and type a Y, a yes, a funny joke in the questions pane. All right, looks like I'm coming through all right, so that's awesome. Again, my name is Nick Cortina here with Exago. Very excited about today's support lab. I think it's going to be an interesting one, a little bit different from support labs that we've done previously. We're going to call this one a bit of an advanced end user support lab. And so the topic of today's support lab is the report SQL relationship and what the connection between reports that we design and the SQL they use is. And so for that reason, that's kind of why we're calling it this advanced end user lab. So if you are attending this lab, just some things that we want to be really upfront about. You're going to see some basic SQL. We're going to keep it really simple, just show you some basic tools and things that will be helpful for you to understand from the context of designing reports. The one thing I just want to mention here is that we're going to do our best to really go nice and slow. I promise it's not going to be real scary. We're going to talk through everything together. I'll show you the things that are worth taking a look at. There's going to be some bits and pieces that aren't totally relevant. We'll talk just a little bit about what those are and what we're seeing. Again, we're going to go nice and slow, but if this sounds like the type of thing that might be going a little bit too deep for you, this might not be the lab for you. So we really just want to be upfront about that, make sure we're all on this before we keep moving forward here. So what exactly are we going to talk about? Well, in order to really get the context of what today's lab is about, we first just want to talk just a little bit about what exactly Exago is and what exactly a report actually is and how those two things relate to SQL, and also what even is SQL and why does that matter? And then we'll take a closer look at how some report design decisions that we'll employ are actually impacting that SQL, and we're going to do so through the use of a couple examples. So what is Exago? Well, it's a report building application. It's a piece of software that we interface with to create reports. And what actually is a report? Well, it's kind of just a fancy way to display data. To go a little bit deeper on that, a report is really a layer of abstraction between the database and the end user. A report is a way for us to not actually have to use SQL and have a full understanding of SQL to be able to interact with our database and get and display data in a meaningful way. Now, how do these reports actually retrieve that data? Well, they use SQL. So what exactly is SQL? Well, SQL stands for Structured Query Language, and SQL is effectively how we talk or communicate to a database to ask for data. The different pieces of what's called a SQL statement will dictate what elements of data are brought back from the data source and the format that that data is brought back. In the context of Exago, that's going to translate to how some of that information is actually displayed on any given report. So with that in mind, how are we going to be able to alter given reports or different pieces of reports to manipulate that SQL to get exactly what we want? Well, the best way to show that is really through the use of some examples. So let's jump over to Exago and get to the good stuff. So I've just navigated into my local 19.1 instance here. And today we're actually going to be leveraging an interesting new 19.1 feature that can be enabled in the admin console that allows us to actually see the SQL of a report without actually executing it. And we'll see that in just a second here. So to kick things off, let's start with one of the most basic examples that we can start with. So I'm going to create a new report here. I'm going to select Advanced Report. And we'll input a name here. So we'll say SQL report relationship. I'll throw that in my lab folder here. When we navigate to categories, we're going to keep things simple to start. As many of you folks are aware, we love using the Northwind data set for simple examples. So we're going to start with this employees category or the employees table. I'm going to drag that over. I'm not going to add any sorts and filters just yet. Again, I want to keep this first example very simple. I'm going to jump over to my layout tab here, And let's start by dragging the last name data field in. We'll see that down here in the little preview, we're just going to have that last name field being displayed. And I'm going to hit finish. That's going to create our report. And I'll stretch this out just a little bit so that our title's got some space. So now, if we start with this report here and we were to simply execute it, what we're going to see is a list of the last names of the employees and a couple extra that I've added to my local data set. But this is the set of employees that are included by default in the Northwind data set, each of their last names being shown up once per line. If we take a look back at that report designer, we've just got a simple detail section that's spitting out those last names. And so this report generated that output. This is something that everyone's probably fairly familiar with after using Exago. But what's actually going on behind the scenes here to go and get this information and bring it back so that Exago can then format it in the context of this report? As I mentioned, we're going to take a look at one of those new features that 19.1 offers. So I'm going to jump into my report options cogwheel. I'm going to go down to advanced. And again, just something to keep in mind is if you don't see this setting in your 19.1 Exago instance, it is a setting that we have to enable in the admin console. So that's just something to keep in mind. And down here, I'm going to click this show generated SQL. So this is going to bring up some information about the SQL that this report is actually sending off to the data source so that we can get that information back and the report can format it to display the output that we just saw before. So this is the actual SQL statement. So what exactly are we looking at here? What is this SQL statement actually doing? Starting from the top here, the first thing we're going to notice is this Southern Gust. And this is just the cheeky name that I've put into my admin console behind the scenes for Northwind, right? Northwind, Southern Gust. I got to find ways to get little jokes in here and there. Keeps my day interesting, if you will. But the first bit of the SQL statement that we can see here on line 1 is the select. So what does this select actually mean in the context of the SQL? To put it in layman's terms, this means go get me something. Go retrieve the following information, where that following information is going to be displayed on lines 2 and 3 here. On line 2, we can see that we're getting the employee's last name field. So here, employees dictates the name of the object, the table in the data source, and last name is the specific field that we're retrieving. And we can even see behind here, it's a little bit faded, but that employee's last name, that's the actual data field being translated into the syntax that the SQL needs to use in order to get that information from the data source. Now, we're seeing a couple other bits of information here as well, and I'd like to touch on those for just a moment. In addition to employee's last name, we also see this DBO. Now, DBO is the actual schema information. And you might be saying, well, what is schema? That sounds like the name of an insect or something like that. Schema refers to the owner of a database. In the context of what we're doing in Exago and the impact that our report design decisions have on this SQL statement, this component isn't going to be relevant. And the reason why is because this information is derived from information that's established in the admin console. Us as report designers do not have an impact over this component of the SQL statement. And so for that reason, when we do begin to make design decisions, this isn't something that we need to consider too closely. It can be helpful to understand just a little bit about what it is, but in the context of what we're doing today, it's not really that relevant. Another thing that we're going to notice is at the end of employee's last name, it says as C0. This as in the SQL statement is a way to alias certain parts of the SQL. This allows us in SQL to reference employee's last name as C0 in other parts of the SQL statement if needed. In this case, it's not necessary, so we won't see this appear again later on in the SQL statement. Sometimes in larger SQL statements, or sometimes referred to as queries, we might need to use employee's last name again, and it's just easier to use C0. Exago is automatically applying these aliases into the SQL statement for us. So again, this is another component of the SQL statement that in the context of changes we are making as report designers is not quite as relevant. So I wanted to touch on what this is so that we understand what we're looking at, but just keep in mind that the schema information, as well as this aliasing here, is not totally important to fully understand. It's just helpful to be able to see what's going on here and have an idea to say, all right, that's something that I don't necessarily need to consider too closely. Something else we notice here, however, on line 3, we're also retrieving the employee ID from the employees table. But we'll notice that that information's not included on the report behind the scenes. We didn't drag on employee ID when we created this report. So you might be thinking, why is employee ID included in my SQL statement? One of the things that happens behind the scenes from an administration perspective when setting up Exago and establishing data connections is we establish a unique identifier, a unique way to look at each record of information that comes back from the data source. Those unique identifiers are automatically added to every SQL statement that Exago is going to use. For that reason, we'll see whatever fields are used to uniquely identify records added to each SQL statement. Employees, the table, uses employee ID to uniquely identify records. Because that's configured in both my database and in Exago's admin console, employee ID from employees will be included in the select each time I have the employees table on a report. Now, the final piece of this SQL statement that starts on line 4 here is the from. This effectively is saying, where am I getting these other bits of information from? And in this case, we can easily derive that these are coming from the employees table by virtue of the fact that it says employees.last name, employees.employee ID. But in terms of the syntax that the SQL statement is going to use, we're still going to include from and then the specific table name itself. So a few different things happening here, but again, we're keeping it pretty simple just to start. Just keep in mind that going forward, every time we see these DBOs and as, we don't really need to consider those too closely. The things that we do want to understand are the select, the different fields, why we might see these ID fields that we don't include on the report, and then the from as well. So I want to pause there for just a second, make sure we're doing okay on questions. Perfect, it looks like everyone's with us so far. So I'm going to go ahead and close this SQL statement. Now, what else might we add to this report that's going to impact that SQL statement? Well, if we recall, when I first created this report, we didn't add any sorts. So the information is really just coming back in the order that it's stored in the data source. So let's make a couple quick changes here. I'm going to go ahead and insert a column after, and I'm going to drag in the employee first name. And let's just type first name in here so we know what we're looking at in terms of the output. I'm going to center and bold that. And let's center align our data fields here too, because why not? It'll look a little bit nicer. And while we're at it, I'll merge these cells too. So now what I'm going to do is go into my report options and our sorts. And I'm going to add a sort on the employee first name. I'm going to hit OK, so we save that sort. Now let's run this report again so we can take a look at the new output. And we can see that looking at the right-hand side, the information's ordered alphabetically by the first names that appear for each given employee. So with that in mind, let's jump back to our report designer and let's take a look at how that SQL statement has changed now that we've added that sort. So the first thing that we're going to notice is different here is now on line 3, we're also getting that first name field. Again, that's from the employees table. But something else has been added here as well, and we can see that down on line 7. That's this order by. So this is effectively what's telling us how the information is ordered, how it's sorted, to use the Exago lingo. And the interesting thing here is that sorting, that ordering, is actually being performed in the database by virtue of this SQL statement. So Exago is intelligently saying, because we've added this sort, push that information into the SQL statement so that the database can take on the ownership of actually sorting that information. And by the time that information is brought back to Exago, it's already sorted so that Exago doesn't have to do that additional legwork. It can just worry about formatting and making the information look nice for the final report output. As we can see here, we're ordering by the employee's first name. And the final thing that we're going to see here is this ASC, and that stands for ascending. Now, something interesting to keep in mind, if ascending means alphabetical, starting from A going to Z, etc., if we go back to our sorts menu here, we do have the option to switch from ascending to descending. And if we do that, we'll hit OK. Let's go back to that SQL again. Now we're going to see something slightly different here. And that's because we switched the order of that sort. So Exago is again going to intelligently update that information for the SQL statement, because the database is always going to be able to perform some of these operations a little bit quicker than Exago can. And Exago knows and understands that. And so for that reason, it's pushing that additional legwork off to the database so that by the time the information gets back, Exago can just focus on the formatting aspect. So we talked a little bit about how those sorts might impact the SQL statement, but there's another key report feature here that we didn't choose to use that's also going to be pushed into that SQL statement as well. And that's going to be our filters. So let's go back into our options cogwheel. We'll go into our filters here. And let's say that we want to pull in an employee last name filter. Again, we're going to keep it really simple, so that way we can just focus on that SQL statement. And we're going to set this equal to, and why don't we just pick Steve Buchanan here? So we can see that we've set the employee last name equal to Buchanan. We'll hit OK. And if we run the report again, we're going to get just that singular record back, Stephen Buchanan. So what does that change look like in terms of the generated SQL? Let's go back into our options cogwheel, show generated SQL. Again, everything is the same except for this new bit here, the where. So this is effectively taking the information that we inserted as a filter onto this report, pushing it into our SQL statement so that the database knows, hey, we don't need each and every single employee record. We only need the employee records where the employee last name field is equal to Buchanan or has a value of Buchanan. Now, this information was generated from what we inserted into that value in the filter. Now, we can always certainly type values out here directly into the filter, but something to keep in mind is that when we use this dropdown, this is actually submitting another SQL statement to the data source each time we click this arrow. And so for that reason, it's more effective to use the arrow to pick values, because then the generated SQL, if I were to pick, say, Steve Irwin, a personal hero of mine, and we go back to advanced and show that generated SQL, this is guaranteeing that that value is going to get matches when it goes back to the data source. Whereas if we type something in manually, it's possible that we have a user error, we make a spelling mistake, perhaps we don't capitalize the first letter, and the database won't match those values. And that's part of why when we go through and help folks build reports or we're instructing users, we always recommend using that dropdown wherever possible. Now, we've been looking at some simple examples so far. Let's take it one step further. Let's open our options cogwheel and go to the categories. And let's say that we wanted to see some order information in addition to employee information. So I'm going to drag that orders category over, the orders table, I might say. I'm going to hit OK. And here's an interesting consideration. I'm not going to add any data fields from orders to my report. When we run this report, in contrast to this execution, or let's say our previous execution for Stephen Buchanan, because we should still have that filter set here. And let's go back and change this to not Irwin, but let's go back to Buchanan. When we run this report now, we're going to see many records generated for Stephen Buchanan, and we didn't add any fields from orders. So oftentimes we'll get questions about, well, why do I see these repeated records? And as a small shout out, we actually do have a lab all about repeated information that you can check out for a little bit more of an in-depth discussion about situations just like this one. But in this case, the answer as to why we saw those repeated records is actually going to lie in the SQL itself. If we go down into the advanced generated SQL here, if we look at the select, other additional pieces of information here. On line 4 and on line 6, there's some additional bits of information. First, the order ID from orders and the employee ID from orders. So why are we seeing both of these? Well, on line 4, we're getting order ID because that's the unique identifier for records from the orders table. Even though we didn't add data fields from orders to our report, simply by adding that category to our report, Exago will add that category to the SQL statement, and it will get the unique identifier for that category and add it to the select portion of our SQL statement. Another thing we'll notice with regards to the employee ID that comes from orders is we need to be able to generate a relationship between employees and orders so that when information is displayed on the report, it's displayed side by side in a logical manner if we choose to include information from the orders table. We need the employee ID from orders so that way we can make sure that the bits of information from both employees and orders line up in a logical manner. Looking down below here, there's going to be an additional component that furthers that, that topic I just mentioned, and that's called a join. On line 9, we can see that we have what's called an inner join. That means if you imagine a Venn diagram, that we're only getting information at the intersection between employees and orders. That means if there's employee information that doesn't have corresponding order information, it will not be included. If there is order information that does not have corresponding employee information, it will not be included. Now, your next question might be, well, how do we know if there's corresponding information between orders and employees? We do that on line 10 here using the employee ID field. So we say inner join, again, get me the only the intersection between employees and orders. On, which effectively says which fields do we use to check that relationship to see where the intersection lies. And on line 10, we establish that we're using employees.employee ID and checking to find equal values in orders on the employee ID. So for any records where the employee ID matches the orders employee ID, those records will be included based on this generated SQL. Anytime that this does not match, the employee ID from employees does not match orders.employee ID, that information will not be included on this report. So I want to pause there for just a second because joins obviously start to add a little bit of complexity to the SQL statement. So I want to pause for just a moment and we'll take a look at some questions here. So we had a question come in about Cartesian joins, and the question specifically, is this called a Cartesian join? So this is not a Cartesian join. This is simply an inner join, which again is only getting the intersection between the two given objects. We do have some documentation on Cartesian products that we can include as a follow-up. So we'll follow up with some documentation on that request. So we're going to keep moving forward here. There's a couple other questions that we might dig into a little bit later on, just because they're going to get a little bit more specific and nuanced. So I'd like to just keep things general, just for the context of the lab for right now. So I'm going to close that out, and there's one other component that I'd like to discuss today before we wrap things up, and then we'll open it up to more specific questions. One of the new things that Exago has actually recently added, not in our 19.1 version, but actually in our 18.2 version, is the ability to push certain filters to the database. And the reason why this can be beneficial is, as I mentioned before, databases can be more efficient in some of the calculations that might need to be performed. And so wherever possible, Exago is going to look for areas where it can push that work off to the database so it can focus on the components of the report that it knows how to do best, namely formatting and displaying that output. So with that in mind, I'm going to go back into my filters menu. And I'm going to remove this last name filter. And I'm going to use the add formula filter here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, let's grab the employee first name. I'm going to use my concatenate operator. I'm going to add a simple space. And then I'm going to type last name. And so now this filter that we're going to use is going to be evaluated equal to a first name with a space and then a last name. So with that in mind, if I come back here, we can see Stephen Buchanan. So I'm going to just type that information in here. Now we can see that that value is going to be equal to Stephen Buchanan. And if we run this report, again, we're going to see basically the same output we saw before, but now we're still using that formula filter instead of the basic filter. And if we go back and look at that SQL again, now in the where component of the SQL statement on line 13, we're going to see two additional components here have been added. And this is where things will start to get just a little bit more tricky than what we saw before. Now, we're actually using SQL formulas to concatenate the employee first name and a space, and then the result of that concatenation with the employee's last name. And we're then checking to see if that value is equal to Stephen space Buchanan. Again, this is Exago trying to intelligently push work off to the database whenever and wherever possible. There are other areas where this can potentially happen within Exago as well. One of those can be aggregating within the database in cases where we might use groupings or things of that nature, and we have aggregates in database turned on. Again, we used the concatenate operator in Exago But Exago has logic behind the scenes to intelligently translate that into the appropriate SQL function, such that the SQL will be able to still understand and communicate with the database and return what we're actually looking for based on the formula that we created. So we had a great question just come in. Does the filter drop list have the concatenated values? At this time, the filter by formula component does not have the ability to go get the values from the data source. So that is a current limitation that we would have to work around using the filter by formula. So at this point, that's going to come to the conclusion of what we wanted to discuss during today's lab. We hope that that was informative for you folks. We will stick around to answer any other questions that come in, just to make sure that we tie up any loose ends. And if anyone's got anything else that they'd like to ask about, feel free to post those in the chat now. As always, we hope that this was informative, and happy reporting.